Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Si vous pouvez prendre vos sièges, on va commencer. Alors, bienvenue à Montréal, bienvenue au Québec, bienvenue au Canada. C'est vraiment, on est chanceux aujourd'hui d'avoir cet événement. Je m'appelle Carl Matviiichuk, je suis directeur exécutif de l'Institut montréalais d'études sur le génocide et les droits de la personne à l'Université Concordia. Puis, on a beaucoup de gens dans notre salle qui ne parlent pas français. Alors, je vais changer en anglais, alors j'espère que c'est correct. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. And we're pleased to welcome our distinguished guest, Oleksandra Matviiichuk, and others to Montreal today to have an important discussion, the John Lemieux Human Rights Lecture. For those of you who don't know, we're now into year 2 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a breach of the UN Charter. There's been systemic human rights abuses, including the abduction of children from Ukraine sent to Russia. The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin for crimes against children, but there are a plethora of other crimes. And this is a marking moment for Ukraine. It's a marking moment for European security. It's a marking moment for human rights, as we have a permanent member of the UN Security Council threatening to use nuclear weapons against countries that are trying to help Ukraine. And we see the world is in flux. So we're very pleased to have the John Lemieux lecture this year to talk about what can be done, what can Canada do to protect Ukrainians, both its people and its government. Our institute has been working with what resources we have to help Ukrainians. We've created, with the support of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung from Germany, we created the Global Parliamentary Alliance Against Atrocity Crimes to bring members of parliament from Europe and Canada together to coordinate strategies and policies to protect Ukrainians. In this building last October, we held the inaugural Montreal International Security Summit, where we looked and brought top global leaders to look at what could be done to counter Russian disinformation, Russian military threats, and protect Ukrainians from a whole set of human rights abuses. And I had the great pleasure of traveling to Belgium last November as part of a MIGS delegation to work with the International Bar Association to look at setting up an ad hoc tribunal to try Russia for the crime of aggression. And presentations were given at the Belgian Parliament and the European Parliament. So this is part of our DNA. We believe in helping Ukraine, and we know Canadians, Quebecers, and Montrealers do too. So today, I'm going to pass the floor soon to Magda Popianu, City Councillor and Executive Committee Vice Chair of the Ville de Montréal. And then we're going to have Oleksandra Matviiichuk, the Nobel Prize laureate from Ukraine, speak for 10 minutes to deliver the John Lemieux Human Rights Lecture, followed by a panel discussion. And we've assembled a very stellar panel of Laura Julie Perrault of La Presse, who will moderate this discussion. And Oleksandra will join that discussion, as well as with the Honorable Chris Alexander, who's been an outspoken voice. I think he's written more op-eds in the Globe and Mail than anyone in Canada arguing to support Ukraine. And we also have Mark McKinnon from the Globe and Mail. He's been the top Canadian journalist, reporting from the front lines and telling the stories of what Ukrainians are dealing with. So with that being said, I would now like to ask Magda Popianu. Je t'invite à venir prendre la parole.
Madame la récipiendaire du prix Nobel de la paix en 2022, Oleksandra Matviiichuk, Monsieur les ministres, Monsieur Kyle Matthews, Monsieur les panélistes et Madame les panélistes, distingués invités, bonjour. Je me sens privilégiée d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui en tant que responsable de la démocratie montréalaise. Je suis membre du comité exécutif et bien sûr que je porte la parole de la mairesse de Montréal qui vous salue. Elle aurait souhaité être avec vous dans ce moment très important. Je veux tout d'abord adresser toutes mes félicitations à Madame Matviiichuk pour son prix Nobel de la paix. Vous êtes un modèle d'engagement pour nombreux d'entre nous. Thank you for your incredible work documenting war crimes at the helm of the Center for Civil Liberties, and the International Federation for Human Rights. Thank you also for taking the time to come and to talk us and discuss with us your fight for democracy and respect for human rights. Il rejoint les valeurs que défend notre ville, le respect, l'équité, la solidarité et la dignité humaine. Merci aussi à Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies et bien sûr à l'Université Concordia pour l'organisation de cette conférence. La ville de Montréal a condamné et continue de condamner fermement l'attaque russe en Ukraine, une violation du droit international. Au nom de toutes les Montréalaises et tous les Montréalais, je veux exprimer notre sincère et profonde solidarité avec le peuple ukrainien, comme nous l'avons fait d'ailleurs en 2022, dans une déclaration appuyée par tous les membres du conseil municipal et adoptée à l'unanimité. We can only admire the exceptional courage and determination of the Ukrainians to defend their country, freedom, and democracy. I also want to reiterate my encouragement to the large Ukrainian community in Montreal, and especially to the people who have recently arrived here because of the war. The city's door will continue to be open to the Ukrainian people. Montreal is a metropolis of peace, inclusive, and open to the world. La diversité montréalaise, c'est notre plus grande force. D'ailleurs, vous avez compris, moi aussi, je fais partie de la diversité montréalaise. De nombreuses personnes d'origine ukrainienne sont venues s'installer à Montréal depuis le 19e siècle et ont joué un rôle inestimable dans le développement de notre ville. Ce sont aujourd'hui tous les Montréalais et les Montréalaises qui bénéficient de cet apport le plus enrichissant. D'ailleurs, je remercie de tout cœur à la communauté ukrainienne d'avoir contribué au développement de la ville. Montréal, en tant que gouvernement de proximité, est fier d'avoir soutenu l'arrivée des milliers de vôtres en participant à la production d'un plan d'intégration pour les personnes migrantes ukrainiennes au Québec, en mettant en place un système de gestion des offres citoyennes d'hébergement, en ayant organisé la distribution de trousses d'accueil et de bienvenue à l'aéroport, en offrant des milliers de cartes d'identification et de résidence à des personnes à haut statut précaire pour leur permettre d'avoir accès aux services municipaux. Votre histoire nous rappelle aussi l'importance de combattre la haine, la violence sous toutes ses formes, partout et en tout temps. Comme le disait si bien Nelson Mandela, priver les gens de leurs droits fondamentaux revient à contester leur humanité même. To deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. C'est pourquoi la guerre en Ukraine et le combat pour le respect des droits de l'homme résonnent si fort en nous. Et c'est pourquoi nous y invitons les Montréalaises et les Montréalais à continuer à promouvoir les droits de l'homme et des libertés pour tous et toutes. C'est essentiel de s'engager à toujours vivre selon les idéaux de paix, de démocratie et de solidarité qui sont au cœur de nos valeurs communes. Merci et bon panel.
Just a couple of side notes. I forgot to mention that also in the panel, we're going to be joined by the Honorable Erwin Kotler. He's not with us physically today, but he'll be joining us remotely. And I'd also say that this event today is made possible thanks to the Lemieux family that supported us to do this, the Caisse des Jardins Ukrainiens de Montréal, who gave us a contribution, as well as Temerity Foundation, that's sponsoring the entire trip of our guests across Canada, and the Canada-Ukraine Foundation. So now I would like to give a warm welcome to Oleksandra Matviiichuk and ask her to come take the stage.
Thank you very much for providing me a floor. It's a huge honor for me to address to this distinguished audience. I'm a human rights lawyer And I have been applying the law to defend people and human dignity for many years. But now I and other Ukrainian human rights colleagues are in a situation when the law doesn't work. When large-scale war started, we united efforts with dozens of organizations from different regions. We built a national network of local documentators, and working together, only for 2 years of large-scale war, we jointly documented more than 72,000 episodes of war crimes. And to be honest, we are documenting something more than just violations of Geneva and Hague Conventions. We are documenting human pain. I will tell you one story. This is a story of 10-year-old boy Ilya Matviiichuk from Mariupol. When Russians tried to siege the city, they didn't allow International Committee of Red Cross to open green corridors and to evacuate civilians. Hence, Ilya and his mother hid in the basement of their residential building from Russian shellings. They melted snow to have water, and they made fires to cook at least some food. But when supplies ran out, they were forced to go out, and suddenly they appeared in the center of Russian shelling. Ilya's mother was hit in her head, and boy's legs was torn. With the last strength, his mother took her son to the friend apartment. There was no medical assistance. Prior to this, Russians deliberately destroyed hospitals and entire medical infrastructure in Mariupol. So in this friend apartment, they were just laying on a couch and hugging each other. They were laying like this for several hours. And this 10-year-old boy, Ilya, told to my colleague that his mother died and got frozen right in his arms. I have one question. How we people who live in 21st century will defend a human beings, their lives, their freedom, their human dignity? Can we rely on the law, or does just brutal force matter? The answer to this question is important not just for people in Ukraine, in Syria, in Iran, in Sudan, or Nicaragua. The answer to this question will define our common future. We are dealing with formation an entire authoritarian bloc. I live in Kiev, and my native city is constantly being shelled not just by Russian rockets, but also Iranian drones. China helped Russia to circumvent sanctions and import technologies critical to warfare. North Korea provided Russia with more than 1 million artillery shells. Syria votes for Russia in UN General Assembly. All these regimes which capture power in their countries have one common feature. They have one idea, what is a human being is. These regimes denied people in their rights and freedoms. They see people like an object of their control, while democracies are created to defend human rights and freedoms. And there is no way to negotiate it, because only existence of free world always provides a threat to dictatorships to load their power. And that is why this is not just a war between two states, Russia and Ukraine. This is a war between two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. And with this war, Russia attempts to convince the entire world that democracy, rule of law, and human rights are fake values because they couldn't protect anyone during the war. Russia attempts to convince that the country with a strong military potential and nuclear weapon can break international order, can dictate its rules to entire international community, and even forcibly changed internationally recognized borders. And if Russia succeeds, it will encourage other authoritarian leaders in different parts of the globe to do the same. And we can find ourselves in a world which will be dangerous for everyone, without any exceptions. As a human rights lawyer, I notice how quickly this war turned people into the numbers, because the scale of war crimes grows so large that it becomes impossible to recognize all the stories. But I will tell you one. This is a story of 62-year-old civilian Oleksandr Shelipov. He was killed by a Russian soldier near his house. He was unarmed. This tragedy received a huge media coverage only because it was the first court trial after invasion. On the court, his wife Katerina shared that her husband was an ordinary farmer, but he was her whole universe. And she told the judge that now she lost everything. People are not numbers. We must ensure justice for all people, regardless who they are, their social position, the types of crime they endured, and whether or not media or international organizations are interested in their case. Because the life of each person matters. I know, as a human rights lawyer, that even when you can't rely on the legal instruments, you can still rely on people. Because we get used to things through the lens of the states and interstates organizations, but ordinary people have a much great impact that they can even imagine. Ordinary people can change the world history quicker than the UN intervention. I know this also because when large-scale wars started, not just Russia, but also our international partners thought that we have no potential to resist to such enormous opposing power. And even international humanitarian organizations evacuated their personnel. But ordinary people remained. And ordinary people started to do extraordinary things. It were ordinary people who took people out from their ruined cities. It were ordinary people who helped to survive under artillery's fire. It were ordinary people who broke through the encirclement to provide humanitarian aid, and suddenly it became obvious that ordinary people fighting for their freedom and human dignity are stronger than even the whole Russian military machine. I don't wish anyone go through this experience. The war probably is the most horrible things which can happen. But these dramatic times provide us an opportunity to reveal the best in us, to be courageous, to fight for freedom, to make a difficult but right choices, and to help each other. Because when we help in each other's, only in this moment we are acutely aware what does it mean to be human. And I'm here to say that despite everything, the story of Ukraine is a life-affirming story because it's dramatic times which raise hope. Because when freedom is denied, it's become powerfully break out through every concrete individuals. We people in Ukraine, in this war with Russia, fighting for our freedom. The future is unclear for us, but we know that future is not pre-written, and we still have a chance to fight for future we want for us and for our children. And this is a luxury to have a chance. Thank you.
Thank you for the powerful speech and letting us understand what Ukrainians are going through and giving us hope, but also understanding the authoritarian axis. I think this is really key for everyone to know. Our security, our human rights, our democracies are also under threat, and we have to support Ukraine. And if we don't, I'm fearful what it means for the rest of the world. With that being said, I would now like to invite our distinguished panelists, Laura Julie Perrault, Oleksandra Matviiichuk, Chris Alexander, and Mark McKinnon to please come onto the stage. And Erwin Kotler is going to join us online.
Alors, bonjour à tous. C'est un vrai honneur d'animer ce panel aujourd'hui et tout un panel, disons-le. On pourrait parler en français aujourd'hui, mais pour notre invité d'honneur, on va on va surtout parler anglais puisqu'on aimerait bien qu'elle participe à la discussion. Excusez-moi, je pense que j'ai un petit problème de micro. Ça? Alexandra, it's such a pleasure to have you here today, and thank you for the speech. And I will introduce the rest of the panel a little bit for your own benefit, but you also have all biographies, so I will be brief. And I have to tell you on a private note, Alexandra, that your small stay in Montreal is also allowing three of us that are right here to do a reunion after 20 years. So
I'm glad.
Mark, Chris, and I were all in Moscow at the beginning of the 2000s when Russia was quite a different place, but it was the beginning of the Putin regime. It was right in the middle of the Second Chechen War, where there was horrible violation of human rights. Both Mark and I got to go on the ground to cover. So it's kind of a special reunion, and also this is a very auspicious day to have this conversation, considering that this is the 80th anniversary of the D-Day. So we have that in mind too. And we have Erwin Kotler at the back. Hello, Erwin. Nice to see you. Who's been involved also in human rights in the ex-Soviet Union for as long as we can remember. So he's been very central to this fight. So it will be a very interesting discussion. And exactly to open this, so just to briefly introduce Chris Alexander to my left. So Chris was a Canadian diplomat in Russia, but also and first ambassador of Canada, resident ambassador of Canada to Afghanistan after the Taliban regime. And Chris has been then Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, and he was an MP during the Harper government. Today, he's a distinguished fellow with both the Canadian International Council and McDonald Laurier Institute, and he's being really, really active in commenting on the war. So hello, Chris, nice to see you again.
Salut.
And then Mark McKinnon, as he was already introduced, has been the Canadian journalist covering the most extensively the war in Ukraine. Mark has won seven national newspaper award, among other things. I know this weekend he's publishing a long form piece about Ukraine. And Mark is also notable for having asked President Zelensky for help when it was time to help some of the fixers that we work with in Afghanistan to come out after the return of the Taliban. And Mark is the author of a book that was prescient called The New Cold War that he published in 2007, if I'm not mistaken.
A long time ago, yeah.
And we're all expecting the next book soon, Mark. So, and Erwin Cutler, as I say, is just like you, a human rights lawyer, a very distinguished one. He's the international chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, also an emeritus professor of law at McGill. He was a member of parliament from 1999 until 2015 and was Minister of Justice. And in this sense, did push forward many issues about human rights. So I think we have a lot to talk about and a little time, so I will right away turn the microphone to you. First, Chris, I would like to ask you if you can give me some impression on Aleksandra's speech and what you take away from it.
Well, Aleksandra's first great gift to us is to bring us all together, not just in this room for this lecture, but across Canada. When I see the smiling face of my former colleague in the House of Commons, Erwin Cutler, behind me, and the two of you, I know, and all of you in this room, I know how strong Canada's support has been for Ukraine, not just since 1991, dating back centuries, certainly to the first waves of Ukrainian immigration. And I think we can make arguments that go even further than that. We have a role to play here. And Aleksandra, having you in Canada, visiting several cities, helps to mobilize us not just as individuals, not just as advocates, but as a society to pay attention to what is going on in Ukraine, to scale up our support for Ukraine at a time when there are so many other distractions and competing priorities. So let's give Aleksandra another round of applause for bringing us together. But the main point that I take from your speech, and I had the honor of hearing you first in person in Berlin last fall at another event hosted by like-minded people, including some other Canadians in Europe, it is that through you, we see the link between military action, sacrifice, the kind of sacrifice that took place on June 6, 1944 on the beaches of Normandy, and the human rights, the regimes, the conventions, the rule of law that backs those regimes in our countries that we have essentially taken for granted for 80 years. We would not have had that rule of law in as many countries on the scale we had it, certainly not in Europe, had it not been for that sacrifice on June 6th and the days that came after, and all the sacrifices that came before in North Africa and Italy. And we now need to think again with this major threat still facing Ukraine every day, taking away too many Ukrainian lives, threatening other countries in Europe, about what level of sacrifice it will take to lay a foundation for another era of greater respect for human rights in more countries, more flourishing of democracy in the countries that have had it for a long time and in countries that are trying it for the first time. It's going to take more that we've been doing, and you inspire us to talk about that and take that message to a larger audience. So thank you.
Erwin, would you like to follow suit? Erwin?
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear it. I share the words of Chris Alexander, and I think what Alexandra has pointed out to us is that what's at stake here is the larger struggle for justice between democracy and authoritarianism, and that what is at stake here is not simply the crimes of aggression of Russia, but the fact that if this culture of impunity for these crimes of aggression continue, it will not end only with the aggression of Russia, which again, as Alexandra reminded us so importantly and pertinently, Russia is aligned here or being supported by Iran and North Korea and the like. So what we have here is really the community of democracies that is confronting an axis of evil. But the most important point of her remarks were those that referenced how each one of us can be a force for good, and that the aggression should not simply be this drumbeat of evil, should not be seen simply in terms of the horrific war crimes and crimes against humanity. And she mentioned the 70,000 plus prosecutions and the like. But we have to realize that behind every statistic is an individual suffering human being. And at the same time, these individual human beings are the human resource that inspire us and that underpin our struggle for democracy, for international justice, for human rights, for which she herself has been an inspirational model for all of us. I found her words to be a testament to both moral and legal clarity, and they underpin all that we have to do individually and collectively in the struggle for justice for Ukraine, which is, in effect, at the end of the day, justice for us all.
Super. Thank you, Oren. Mark, would you like to add something?
A newspaper journalist speaking after a Nobel Peace Prize laureate and two politicians. I would just say the message I took from Oleksandra's remarks was don't look away. And what I can say, I just came from my annual trip to head office in Toronto, and the bad news is we are looking away. We can track the level of interest in stories about Ukraine about anywhere. And 2 summers ago in 2022, with the exception of some very unique stories from Parliament Hill or the business section, Ukraine was the most read thing online. It's what people wanted more of. And now the message I got from my editors is, we know you like going to Ukraine, we know you like that, but our readers aren't there anymore. Can you, change it up a little bit? And as Laura Julie said, I'm about to land 15,000 more words on Ukraine this weekend. So set aside an hour. But it's the bad news is that's, to counter all, this is remarkable panel and all this, and it's great that you're all here, but the sad news is we are not paying attention, and that's how people like Vladimir Putin win.
I'll bounce back for my first question on what you just said, Mark, about journalists have been documenting, human rights lawyers have been documenting what's happening in Russia like we've never done before. So at the beginning of the war, we were hearing almost on a daily basis about different violations, war crimes. Oleksandra, can you walk us through what's the situation now? And to what extent all this documentation, at some point, some people were saying, there was almost too many people on the ground documenting. Is that true? And what are you going to be able to do with this?
I will start answering this question with reminding all of us that this war started not in February 2022, but in February 2014. This war started when Ukraine obtained a chance for the quick democratic transition, when corrupt authoritarian pro-Russian regime collapsed due to revolution of dignity. And in order to stop us on this way, Russia invaded. Russia occupied Crimea, part of Luhansk and Donetsk regions, and 2 years ago extended this war to the large-scale war. And Russia uses war crimes as the methods of warfare. And that is why the 72,000, which we jointly with our colleagues documented, is just the tip of iceberg. Russia attempts to break people resistance and occupy the country by the tool which I call the immense pain on civilian population. For the first years of war, my organization was focused on the practice of illegal detention, sexual violence, torture, and killing civilians in occupied territories. In order to save control, Russians imposed terror against peaceful population. They deliberately exterminate active local people there: mayors, journalists, children writers, musicians, priests, entrepreneurists, environmentalists. I personally spoke with hundreds of people who survived Russian captivity. They told me how they were beaten, raped, smashed into wooden boxes, their fingers were cut, their nails were torn away, their nails were drilled, they were electrically shocked through their genitalia. One woman told me how her eye was dug out with a spoon. There is no legitimate reason in doing such things. There is also no military necessity in it. Russians did these horrible things only because they could. Because for decades, Russia committed horrible crimes in Chechnya, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Mali, in Libya, in Syria, in other countries of the world. And they have never been punished. They believe they can do whatever they want. So we document these crimes, not just for national archives. I have a huge respect to the work of historians, but we are human rights lawyers. We document these crimes that sooner or later, all Russians who committed these crimes by their own hands, as well as Putin, Lukashenko, top political leadership, and high military command of Russian state, will be brought to justice.
Would you like to comment, Chris, on this?
Just to say that this work is essential, and it's happening on a scale that is probably unprecedented because of the scale of the crimes. But this time it needs to be seen through. I mean, Laura Julie, Mark, you and I discussed in Afghanistan over many years the war crimes that were being committed there. And there were crimes committed by Allied forces and US forces as well, but far greater crimes, as we documented in the United Nations by the Taliban. There was a move for accountability. There was determination to make it work after decades of war in Afghanistan. And now look where we are. We gave up. We stood aside. We looked away as a terrible deal was signed by a benighted president who may come back in the United States. I don't know a single ally that denounced that agreement, although many in private were horrified by it. And the Taliban have come back and put women into a prison of nations again, denied them rights that no regime in the 20th century ever previously denied them. If we do not see through the cause that Oleksandra is working for, is leading in many ways, of accountability in Ukraine, we will all see standards of democracy, respect for human rights decline in all of our countries. And these authoritarians, these tyrants will be on the march. And it's not just Alexandra's work. We can donate all we want. We can have as many human rights activists, human rights lawyers. Her work depends on military success, as she understands better than anyone. And it is only the Ukrainian army that is fighting this evil at this point, that is fighting this much larger army. Yes, with our support, but we have not even given the Ukrainian army the benefit of the military support we sent to Afghanistan. No air power, no command and control, no on-the-ground training, which we, Canada, started to do in 2015 and stopped doing in 2021. Let's not kid ourselves about the support we're offering. We are not offering enough support to see this through at the moment. We are not offering enough support to ensure Ukraine wins. We are not offering the support, the kind of support that our ancestors offered on June 6, 1944 in support of the human rights regime that was under threat in that time.
But we just saw it yesterday with Putin right away when the US allowed for the use of their weapon to maybe do an attack inside Russia right away. There's this fear of retaliation now of using third countries to hit Western countries. To what extent, how do we balance the threat and the need for support? And maybe Oleksandra, you can.
I think that is a trap. When Western democracies start to think and try to develop red lines for themselves, not to make Putin upset. Russia has no red lines. Russia for decades was proactive. Russia commits something horrible, then presented it like fait accompli, like new normality, and push international community to reckon with it. And that is why we're now in this horrible situation, because there is a good Russian proverb, appetite grows during the lunch. And when you play someone's game, you will always fail. I want Western democracy be proactive. I want Western democracy to defend human rights and freedom, because only determination to act defines societies which have future.
I will just walk this back a little bit because, Mark, I wanted to hear you on the documentation of crimes. We've talked about the work of the human rights lawyer, but how do you see the work of journalists on the ground as being part of the documentation of violations? And
Absolutely, that's a big part of why we're there, and anybody who saw what we all saw in places like Bucha and Borodyanka and Izium, you know, you're scarred by it, and you're there, but you know, you're there to record and make sure that the world sees it. And one point I'd make is that I think the Russians understand the importance of this documentation. If you look at the pattern of destroying hotels, and I was speaking to a young man from Dnipro a moment ago, I was saying I stay in Dnipro all the time because the hotel I used to stay at in Donbass has been destroyed by missiles. The hotel I used to stay at in Kharkiv has been destroyed by missiles. The hotel I used to stay at in Zaporizhia has been destroyed by missiles. These hotels were also used by United Nations workers, by NGOs. And I think you can see a pattern there. They're trying to keep us away from, I think they understand the damage that was done to their cause by the world's eyes being revealed, seeing what happened in these places. So I think it's very much part of the overall struggle that Oleksandra outlined between the two systems. And to the other point about, you know, these red lines, I think that Chris is absolutely correct. We haven't, we the West have committed to doing enough to make sure Ukraine so far doesn't lose, but we have not tried to let them win. We're afraid of what that would mean, I think, and that's because of the lack of red lines. I really worry that Vladimir Putin has proven himself to be unpredictable. People say, well, he's not going to do anything. Look, we've escalated several, you know, we've allowed this to happen. We've given this weapon. It hasn't led to World War III, but this is also a man who has repeatedly crossed international borders and broken international law. And, you know, if you look at what he's trying to achieve, and I think that would be a world where we get back to something like a post-Yalta agreement where Russia has a sphere of influence, you know, a direct confrontation with the West, something bigger might be how he perceives the road there.
Oleksandra, when there's more weapons, there's often also more violence. As a laureate in the Nobel Peace Prize, a lot of people have pointed out that it's kind of a bit ironic that you have to ask for more weapons for your country. How do you balance the need for military action, but also the impact it could have on human rights on the ground and on civilian lives?
I was in Kiev when Russian troops tried to circle the city. And because we live in 21st century and we can communicate with each other in a way which can't even dream 30 years ago, we have already know what's going on in Bucha, Matyzh, Vorzel, and other cities and settlements near my native city. But when Ukrainian army pushed Russians from Kiev region, we immediately sent mobile groups, and we was shocked because it's a huge difference to know something and even to witness, not experience, but just to be present there. We found dead bodies of civilians who lay scattered around the streets until their liberations. We found dead bodies of civilians in the gardens of their own households. We found dead bodies of civilians, men, women, children, in mass graves, with their hands tied under their back. We found dead bodies of civilians in civilian cars, which were deliberately shooting by Russians, while the whole family with children tried to escape from the dangerous zone. These people were unarmed. Russians killed unarmed. As a human rights lawyer, I can't wave Geneva or Hague Convention on the face of the Russian tank. The Russian tank will not stop. In 2022, UN Court of Justice obliged Russia immediately stop military actions and withdraw their troops from Ukraine. Russia ignored even the decision of UN Court of Justice. I have no legal tools how to protect people from enforced disappearances, denial of their identity, forcible adoption of their own children, rapes, filtration camps, and mass graves. And that is why I found myself in a weird situation that when someone asks me how to protect human rights in Ukraine, I have to answer, give Ukraine weapons, because it's the only way how we can stop this horror. Now we have military we have delay in 6 months with military assistance because the package was blocked in United States Congress. Let me tell you, it's resulted in numerous deaths, not just in battlefield, but also in deep rear and in occupied territories. Let me tell you that Russia used this pause to go further. And now I found myself in a situation when we received hundreds requests from help from new occupied cities and settlements near Kharkiv region with the border with Russia. And we have no tool how to save people there. I feel myself miserable. So probably when you drink coffee in Geneva, in Berlin, in Washington, and reading newspapers, you can see the world a little bit slightly differently. But when you are in Kharkiv, in Kiev, in Odessa, in Donetsk, in Luhansk, in Crimea, you know that when you can't rely on legal instruments, you have the total right to use legitimate force for self-defense.
Erwin, would you like to add something to what Oleksandra just said?
Well, I certainly concur with what she said. And I think if we look at the 21st century, it began with the mass atrocities of Russia in Chechnya, and it continued. From Russia invasion in Chechnya, we went on to Georgia, the seizure, the Crimea, and so on. And each time, it was attended by indifference and inaction on the part of the international community, which led really to an impunity incentivizing further atrocities and further aggression. And so I think what is so necessary at this point is to secure justice for Ukraine, justice for the victims, and accountability for the human rights violators. That will require the necessary security, military, economic, humanitarian assistance, but also the establishment of an independent international tribunal for the crime of aggression, because all the present frameworks do not provide for that kind of accountability. And I think it's important both for symbolic as well as substantive reasons, and to affirm our commitment to justice for Ukraine as being, as Alexandra has put it, really justice for all, to establish this international tribunal for the crime of aggression and hold Putin and the military and political leadership in Russia and those aiding and abetting from Belarus and elsewhere accountable. And right now, there is no legal mechanism to do so. And in this month, when there are so many historic meetings that are taking place, including Ukraine sponsoring a peace summit that over 100 countries have agreed to in Switzerland at the end of this month, preceded by meetings of the G7 leadership and the like. This is a month when the international leadership is getting together, whether it be as we meet now in Normandy or following up, as I said, with these other meetings, to take the necessary action on all levels and bring about the justice for all that Alexandra has been speaking about.
So while you were saying this, Erwin, I had three heads, an acknowledgement here about the creation of a special tribunal. Since the war, I mean, we can say that international justice was quite active. We saw the International Criminal Court open a case against Putin and against Madame Belova when it comes to children kidnapping and being taken into Russia. We've seen investigation open, we've seen the documentation. Why is it important to have a different tribunal that goes because we know already that the court can't judge the crime of aggression. So why is it important to create a special tribunal? And maybe Oleksandra would give you first dibs on this.
I can just repeat the words of previous speaker that there is no international court who can prosecute Putin and his surrounding for the crime of aggression. Unfortunately, even International Criminal Court has no jurisdiction over the crime of aggression in situation of Russian war against Ukraine. But all atrocities which we are documenting, it's results of their leadership decision to start this war. If we want to prevent wars in the future, we have to punish the states and their leaders who start such wars in present. It's a common logic. But in the whole history of humankind, we have only one such precedent. It was Nuremberg's and Tokyo's tribunals. All other tribunals like Yugoslavia, Rwanda, or Special Court in Sierra Leone, it was very important steps to establish law and justice, but let me simplify it a little bit. People were persecuted because they kill each other during the war, not according to the rules. Because even the war has rules. But we have to put the war as such behind legal frame. And that's why we have to prosecute for the crime of aggression. We have to send a strong signal that if you will start the war, regardless, will you win this war? Will you lose this war? You will be punished. And we have to demonstrate it not just with quoting Geneva and Hague Conventions. We have to demonstrate it with establishing a special tribunal on aggression in the form of international court to provide this special tribunal a power to overcome immunity, which Putin has according to international law.
Would you like to add something, please?
Just to say that Oleksandra is absolutely right. There is no court that can try this crime. In 1945 and the years that came after, the thinking in the international system was that the United Nations Security Council would be the court of Star Chamber, and particularly the permanent members, adjudicating crimes of aggression. And we have Article 51 as a result of that. And an architecture, rarely, if ever, used, that was supposed to deal with this kind of eventuality, which didn't happen on this scale after 1945. So this is an unprecedented situation. One of the members of the Security Council is utterly disqualified, has made itself a rogue, and is the one in need of punishment in this case. And so we need a different instrument. In addition, think of what Moscow has done to the international humanitarian legal regime that all of us have been trying to uphold, certainly in Canada's case, through the entire life of our democracy. 150, or is it 350 medical institutions in Ukraine targeted, hundreds of schools targeted, hundreds of cultural institutions targeted, with devastating result and genocidal intent. And it's not just in Ukraine that they did this. In Syria, while there was coverage of that conflict by some of you on the stage here and others, it also flew under the radar as a conflict for a dozen years, where everything that's happening in Ukraine was done on a slightly smaller scale, but of equally devastating result since 2011, with Russian support, with Russia as the main hammer of humanitarian violation. And so we will not have an international humanitarian regime. We will not have international law unless these crimes are punished. It will take a special tribunal. It will also take a reshuffling of the deck at the United Nations. It is scandalous that the Russian Federation, the so-called Russian Federation, is still a permanent member of the Security Council. They should be stripped of their place, not only their veto power, but their place on the Security Council. That can happen. Very credible international and Canadian experts have outlined what path could be taken. A two-thirds vote of the General Assembly would do this. The General Assembly has come close to this kind of numbers on other issues. But to do this, we have to overcome our fear of this little clique in the Kremlin. And we have to get beyond the propaganda that they use to control our public opinion. That is no small matter. It's on all the platforms. It's in all our media. Most of it, we can't even see how it is being manipulated from Moscow. And we have to have the courage of our convictions. The right to self-defense is the basis of everything. It's the basis of this country's existence. It's the basis of security in Europe and democratic parts of Asia and the rest of the world in this post-war era. It's what countries in Africa, Latin America, and everywhere else want to see upheld and supported. We need to get over our fear to participate in the collective self-defense of Ukraine, not just to virtue signal and look like we're doing some of the good things, but to ensure Ukraine wins. You undertake self-defense in order to be successful, in order to push back the aggressor, in order to regain control of your territory. That is well within Ukraine's power if they get the support of 500 million people in Europe, 400 million people in North America, hundreds of millions of elsewhere, whose economy is many dozens times the size, whose economic potential is many dozen times the size of that of Russia.
And if we can get back to the special tribunal, Mark, I don't know if you want to add something. You've been underground in Ukraine talking to people. What do you think would be the reception of this kind of, like, is there hope amongst the Ukrainian, and Oleksandra, you might want to answer to that, that this could change something on the everyday war?
I think most Ukrainians are much more focused on the everyday war. This is, we're having a very high level discussion here. And the fact that because of that shortage in munitions that resulted from the US pause in aid has Ukraine on the back foot right now. But I'll quote from the last time that I met with Oleksandra, which was in Kyiv, and if I recall correctly, it was after another long night where those drones are sort of buzzing through the skies of Kyiv, and you sort of try and stay awake through the first air raid alarm and then decide whether or not you're going to, in my case, take a melatonin and roll over, or if you think there'll be two that night, not two melatonins, two air raids. I think you said the wiring is broken, the international system. And that's why we're seeing not just Russia feeling empowered to invade Ukraine in 2014 and then escalate in 2022, but why Azerbaijan felt this was the time to take back, from its perspective, Nagorno-Karabakh, why the war in Gaza has erupted, why countries in Latin America are bringing up revisionist, revanchist claims against their neighbors. The system is broken. The system we designed in 1945, as Chris points out, starting with the Security Council, it's broken, and that has us all in a very, very scary new era.
Let's talk about this broken system, because we've been talking about this fight between democracy, authoritarianism, about the need for international justice. Right now, a big part of the world is looking at what's happening, especially because of Gaza, and the speech of many Western leaders when it comes to bringing and trying war crimes against humanity and war crimes. And so the same countries that advocate for more justice in the Ukrainian side are much more reluctant when it comes to the Israeli side. What impact this kind of what many would call double standard has on the future of international law?
I think that we as a human beings have to use Prisma when we look into the world and analyze what's going on, not our sympathy or anti-sympathy, but Prisma of law and humanity. Because I always tell you have to support Ukraine, not because you love Ukraine. Not you can even have to have zero knowledge about Ukrainians, but you have to support Ukraine because this is a right thing to do. Because Russia broke international law and invaded the independent country, and in order to occupy this country, commit horrible atrocities, kill people and erode their identity. And this is a right thing to support people who fight for their freedom and for human dignity. Once again, not because it's Russia and Ukraine, just because you look to this situation through the lens of law and humanity. And the problem is that we lack this lens. I want to share you my personal story. When large-scale war started, I got a letter from Syrian human rights defenders. They wrote to me, they reached me with the words of solidarity. They told me, we are with you. We know what war is about. We know how deep is human suffering and pain. Please tell us, what do you need in your fight for justice? We'll do everything which we can, because your fight, it's our fight. And it was a very important human letter, because it was a time when we celebrate each morning like a victory. We have no idea whether or not Russians will appear next day in the streets of my native city. And this was more than a letter, it was a human gesture of solidarity and support from people who in a horrible situation. Because you rightly mentioned the war in Syria is going for decades, and not in the front page of media anymore. People tortured, raped, killed, but the world turned blind eyes to this. So I think, as a human rights lawyer, we have to use a strategy which was showed by Syrian human rights colleagues. If we start to compete with each other for attention, if we start to say that our pain is much more deeper than your pain, we all will fail. We have to unite our efforts and to fight for justice globally. And in order to do it, we have to push for reform, the cardinal reform of this international system of peace and security, which is not working, which is stalling and reproducing ritualistic movements, which can't protect people against authoritarianism and the wars, which provide all of us under the threats that such fires like wars will emerge more and more often in different parts of the globe, because the whole international wiring is faulty and sparks are everywhere.
Would you like to comment on the idea of double standards and how democracies are acting right now, especially that you've been covering the war in Gaza on the ground?
So I'm just back from my most recent assignment in Israel. You can't get to Gaza; it's closed to media at this moment, or to foreign media at this moment. I'll only say, because I'm a journalist and observer, that the double standard is apparent to people who live there. And in this case, I'm talking about Palestinians who would say, why does Canada oppose the occupation of Crimea, but not the occupation? Why doesn't it take us, like, why aren't we imposing sanctions on the people occupying the West Bank? The court cases which spring from October the 7th are a separate but related issue. But it was good to see, I think, the Canadian government saying, you know, that we support the ICJ ruling. But I think it took, you know, the fact that we sort of put out this convoluted language about the ICC cases against the Hamas leadership and Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Gallant, it's spotted. I mean, we are playing politics, and by doing so, I think helping undermine the system, helping pull the wiring apart. And this should be our national interest to, regardless of who we're talking about, to have international law as the primary consideration for us, because that's Canada's security is rooted in there being international law.
Chris and Erwin, I know you both have strong opinions on this, but I've been told that we have like 3 minutes left. So if you want both to comment on this, but briefly, please. Chris, do you want to start?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think the bigger problem is that there have been no standards. I can make the case to any audience for what the ICC did on Ukraine's behalf by indicting Vladimir Putin. There should be more indictments. The whole Russian chain of command is responsible, not just for crimes in Ukraine, but many other crimes. When it comes to their action on Israel and Gaza, I have a very tough time explaining to an audience why there has been no indictment of the Syrian leadership, why there has been no indictment of the many groups in Sudan responsible for another wave of genocide there, why there was never an indictment of now dead former president of Iran, Raisi, the butcher of Tehran, who personally was responsible for 5,000 murders. We have to be consistent across all conflicts, and we cannot subject conflicts that happen to include a Jewish state to higher standards than we would other conflicts. Let's be clear here also about the links. Hamas is a terrorist organization, a brutal one, who has a lot of friends in Moscow. They visited, their leadership, it was public, visited Moscow 2 or 3 times in the year before October 7th. Their other main patron is Iran, which supplies drones that bomb Kiev almost every day. They are part of this axis of darkness and tyranny and authoritarianism, and they should be treated alongside all the members of that axis that attacked schools and hospitals and civilians and held the people of Gaza hostage for certainly since 2005, should be held accountable for all of that. It's a far greater crime. Let's also keep in mind that the timing of October 7th was partly made in Moscow. The Kremlin wanted a distraction. They went to their friends. They got it. It's working on our campuses. It's working in our public media. Yes, we need to deal with the results. Yes, the Palestinians deserve a better future, but let's not lose sight of the overall plot here, which is that authoritarians are on the march, and our response is so far insufficient, greatly insufficient.
And I will ask Erwin to...
Well, I'll just take up where Chris left off. We are at this point at an important historical inflection moment. We are witnessing a resurgent global authoritarianism, the backsliding of democracies, assaults on human rights, indeed intensifying mass atrocities, the whole taking place amidst a culture of impunity. And so at this point, what's at stake here is the integrity of the international justice system. And what's at stake is the lives of human beings. And I'll go right back to and end with where Oleksandra was thematically speaking about the role and responsibility that each of us have to speak on behalf of those who cannot be heard, to bear witness on behalf of those who cannot testify, to act on behalf of those who are putting not simply their livelihood, but their lives on the line. And as the French say at times, this is these qui s'excuse, s'accuse. Whoever remains indifferent indicts himself or herself.
Thank you, Erwin, for that. So it's already the end of this panel, which I think we could have gone on for much longer. And I will invite Karine Matthews to give the concluding remarks, and you'll be able to talk to the panelists right after. So we can continue this discussion.
Merci, Laura Julie. I'll ask everyone if you could please still stay seated before I give my concluding remarks, which will be very short because they'll be between us and the reception and the food that you're waiting for. I would like to ask to make closing comments. I'm inviting Eugene Zuli to come up. He's the honorary consul of Ukraine in Montreal. Eugene, please.
On April 27, 2022, by unanimous consent, the House of Commons of Canada passed a motion recognizing that the Russian Federation is committing acts of genocide against the Ukrainian people on the basis that the crimes committed by the armed forces of the Russian Federation in Ukraine include, and I quote, mass atrocities in the invaded and occupied Ukrainian territories, systematic instances of willful killing of Ukrainian civilians and the desecration of corpses, forcible transfer of Ukrainian children to the Russian territory, torture and the imposition of life conditions causing grave suffering, and widespread instances of physical harm, mental harm, and rape. Le 23 février 2023, l'Assemblée nationale du Québec a aussi adopté à l'unanimité une motion déclarant, entre autres, qu'à l'instar de la Chambre des communes du Canada, elle dénonce les actes à caractère génocidaire commis contre le peuple ukrainien. What does such recognition of an ongoing genocide oblige the international community to do? 153 states, including Canada, ratified the Genocide Convention that was adopted on December 9, 1948 by the UN General Assembly and undertook to do two things: to prevent and to punish the crime of genocide. In addition to this conventional undertaking, it is clearly in the best interest of the international community to stop this genocide and help Ukraine win Russia's all-out war against Ukraine, since today, Ukraine is shielding us from the Third World War. Indeed, on March 7, 2024, US President Joe Biden recognized that stark reality in his State of the Union address when he said, and I quote, "Overseas, Putin of Russia is on the march, invading Ukraine and sowing chaos throughout Europe and beyond. If anybody in this room," and that's not Eugene Choli speaking, is the President of the United States, "thinks Putin will stop at Ukraine, I assure you, he will not. But Ukraine can stop Putin if we stand with Ukraine and provide the weapons it needs to defend itself." Putin has openly lamented that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and he vowed to restore its so-called past glory. To do so, the Kremlin would need to subjugate once again former Soviet republics and satellite states, many of which are now NATO member countries protected by Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which commits NATO member countries to consider an armed attack against any of them to be an attack against all of them. That is why I said that Ukraine is shielding us today from the Third World War. For the record, in heroically defending its and Europe's territorial integrity, Ukraine has already paid the ultimate price, with tens of thousands of military and civilian casualties, including children. Immeasurable human suffering caused by Russia's genocidal acts and massive destruction by Russia's relentless missile and drone attacks, which total cost of reconstruction and recovery in Ukraine has been assessed at the end of 2023 at $486 billion over the next decade. Unfortunately, this genocide could have been prevented had the West given Ukraine in November and December 2021 and January 2022 a fraction of the help that it provided since then. Today, Ukraine urgently needs sophisticated air defense systems to protect its skies from further destructive missile and drone attacks that kill and injure civilians, including children, as well as weapons and ammunition to liberate its territories from Russia's army and protect Ukraine's and Europe's territorial integrity. When journalists ask me, does Canada do enough to help Ukraine? I answer that no one, not any single person in this room, can say that I am doing enough while there is an ongoing genocide. Until we stop that genocide, everybody needs to do more. I sincerely hope that today's lecture by Nobel Prize laureate Oleksandra Matviiichuk will substantially strengthen Canada's support for Ukraine, as Ukraine's victory is the best guarantee for eventual peace, security, and stability in the world. En terminant, je remercie M. Kyle Matthews, directeur exécutif de l'Institut montréalais d'études sur le génocide et les droits de la personne de l'Université Concordia, et à toute son équipe pour l'organisation de cette importante conférence. Merci à Mme Magda Popianou, vice-présidente du comité exécutif de la Ville de Montréal, pour votre présence et votre allocution au début. Je remercie à tous ceux qui ont participé au panel avec notre invité d'honneur, à savoir l'honorable Chris Alexander, ancien ministre de l'Immigration, des Réfugiés et de la Citoyenneté du Canada, M. Mark McKinnon, correspondant international principal du Globe and Mail, l'honorable Irvin Cutler, président international du Centre Raoul Wallenberg pour les droits de la personne, ainsi qu'à Mme Laura Julie Perrault, journaliste de la presse qui a animé ce panel. Je remercie également la Caisse populaire des Jardins ukrainiennes de Montréal, la famille de John Lemieux, la Fondation Canada-Ukraine, la Fondation Temertey pour le soutien financier. Last but certainly not least, I wish to thank Ukraine's Nobel Prize laureate Oleksandra Matviiichuk for a fascinating lecture on a very difficult subject matter. I hope that your message will not only be heard, but acted upon, so that the fundamental principles enshrined in the UN Charter are respected for our collective well-being. Enfin, je remercie à tous ceux qui sont présents aujourd'hui pour votre participation et votre intérêt sur le sujet. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Eugene, for those words. You've made my job much easier. He said everything I planned to say, so there's not much else. I hope that you'll be able to stay with us. We're having a reception back when you first arrived where we registered you. We're going to move to reception now. But I'd like to take this moment to thank our guests, but really, if we could all give applause to Oleksandra. And in closing, I just want to say to Oleksandra, Montreal is a friend of Ukraine, Quebec is a friend of Ukraine, Canada is a friend of Ukraine, and we must work together to do more to help the country and its people. Thank you.